at 3:17 p.m. Japan Standard Time on May 12, 2026. In the contested waters 190 nautical miles southwest of the Spratly Islands, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force destroyer JS Atago executed a maneuver that would force Beijing to confront a strategic reality it had spent 3 decades trying to prevent. The destroyer did not fire a weapon. It did not issue a warning. It simply maintained course through waters China claims as sovereign territory, while transmitting real-time tactical data to an Australian Hobart-class destroyer operating in parallel track 47 nautical miles to the south. What happened next represents the most significant shift in Indo-Pacific military power projection since the United States withdrew from Subic Bay in 1992. The South China Sea carries $5.3 trillion in annual maritime trade, representing approximately 21% of global commerce by value. 1/3 of all crude oil shipped by sea transits these waters. Liquefied natural gas shipments totaling 389 billion cubic meters annually move through the South China Sea to energy-dependent economies in Northeast Asia. China has constructed 7 militarized artificial islands across the Spratly Archipelago, equipped with surface-to-air missile batteries, electronic warfare systems, radar installations capable of tracking targets 350 miles distant, and runways accommodating combat aircraft with strike radius extending to the entire sea. For 15 years, Beijing has operated under the assumption that no regional power possessed the capability or will to challenge this infrastructure directly. That assumption ended when Australia and Japan announced they would begin coordinated freedom of navigation operations, not as observers supporting American missions, but as independent operators conducting their own transits under their own flags with their own rules of engagement. The announcement arrived buried in a joint communique issued following the Australia-Japan 2+2 Foreign and Defense Ministerial consultations in Canberra on May 8, 2026. The relevant section contained 127 words describing enhanced maritime security cooperation and commitment to upholding international law in the Indo-Pacific region. Those 127 words signal the emergence of an entirely new strategic architecture in the South China Sea that does not center on Washington, does not require American carrier strike groups, and presents Beijing with a challenge it cannot answer using the strategies that neutralize previous opposition. What you are about to hear explains why Chinese military planners are scrambling to adapt decades of operational doctrine to confront a problem they never anticipated, and why the next 6 weeks will reveal whether China's South China Sea strategy survives intact or collapses under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell right now, because this story is developing faster than any news cycle can track. What Australia and Japan are preparing to do in the South China Sea represents a fundamental power shift that will determine the balance of naval forces in the Indo-Pacific for the next generation. You cannot afford to miss a single update as this operation unfolds in real time. The strategic calculation that drives this unprecedented Australia-Japan maritime coordination begins with a simple recognition that has eluded Washington-focused analysts for years. China's South China Sea strategy was never designed to defeat the United States Navy in direct confrontation. The artificial islands, the anti-ship ballistic missiles, the submarine detection networks, the electronic warfare systems, none of these capabilities exist to sink American carriers. They exist to make the cost of American intervention unacceptable by denying the United States the ability to operate freely in waters Beijing claims without risking casualties and equipment losses that would undermine domestic political support for continued engagement. This strategy is called anti-access area denial, military jargon for building an environment so dangerous that an adversary chooses not to enter rather than fighting their way through. The strategy works brilliantly against the United States because American military intervention requires congressional authorization, media scrutiny, public support, and political will that evaporates rapidly when body bags return home from distant conflicts with unclear connection to immediate national security. China does not need to win a war against the United States Navy. China needs only to make the price of winning so high that Washington decides it is not worth paying. For 15 years, this approach succeeded in creating effective Chinese control over 90% of the South China Sea, despite international tribunal rulings declaring the claims invalid, despite freedom of navigation operations conducted by multiple navies, despite diplomatic protests from every Southeast Asian nation with competing territorial claims. But the strategy contains a critical vulnerability that Chinese military planners are only now confronting. Anti-access area denial works by exploiting the gap between capability and will. The United States possesses overwhelming capability to defeat Chinese forces in the South China Sea. What the United States lacks is the political will to accept casualties required to employ that capability. Remove that gap by introducing adversaries who possess sufficient capability and demonstrated will to accept casualties in defense of their own strategic interests, and the entire architecture of Chinese area denial collapses. This is exactly what Australia and Japan represent. Both nations operate modern blue water navies equipped with Aegis combat systems, advanced anti-submarine warfare capabilities, long-range precision strike weapons, and integrated air defense networks. Both nations have domestic defense industries capable of sustaining military operations without foreign resupply. Both nations face direct strategic threats from Chinese expansion that create political will to accept casualties in defense of clearly defined national interests. Australia depends on South China Sea shipping lanes for 63% of its merchandise export value, totaling $267 billion annually. Japan depends on these same lanes for 87% of its crude oil imports and 74% of its liquefied natural gas imports. Unlike the United States, which can absorb South China Sea disruption as a strategic inconvenience, Australia and Japan face South China Sea closure as an existential economic threat. The implications are profound. When the United States conducts freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, Chinese forces can harass, shadow, and deter without serious escalation risk because both sides understand that American political will to respond with force is limited. When Australia and Japan conduct independent operations, Chinese harassment carries entirely different risk calculations. If Chinese forces seriously threaten Australian or Japanese warships operating in international waters, the response will not be filtered through Washington's domestic political considerations. The response will be determined by Canberra and Tokyo based on their own assessment of whether their vital national interests are threatened. This transforms the entire strategic calculus governing military operations in the South China Sea from a question of Chinese area denial versus American will to a question of Chinese area denial versus regional powers with no alternative except to defend their access. Beijing spent 3 decades building a South China Sea strategy optimized to deter American intervention. That strategy is now completely ineffective against the adversaries China actually faces. The artificial islands, the missiles, the radar networks, all of these systems were positioned and equipped to detect, track, and target American carrier strike groups operating from bases in Japan, Guam, and Singapore. None of these systems provide adequate coverage or capability to manage simultaneous independent operations by multiple regional navies approaching from different vectors with different tactical profiles and different risk tolerances. Chinese surface combatants in the South China Sea number approximately 83 vessels distributed across 3 primary flotillas based in Hainan, with additional support from Coast Guard cutters and maritime militia fishing vessels totaling several hundred platforms. This force structure can shadow and harass isolated American operations or intimidate individual Southeast Asian nations. It cannot maintain persistent coverage across 4 million square miles of ocean against coordinated operations by Australia and Japan, while simultaneously deterring the United States and managing territorial disputes with Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. The first coordinated Australia-Japan transit is scheduled for the first week of June 2026, according to sources familiar with operational planning. The mission will involve 2 Australian Hobart-class destroyers and 1 Japanese Maya-class destroyer, conducting independent parallel tracks through the Spratly Islands region, while transmitting tactical data through Link 16 secure data exchange systems. The ships will not operate as a unified task force. They will conduct separate freedom of navigation operations that happen to occur simultaneously in adjacent areas with shared situational awareness. This distinction is legally and strategically significant. A unified task force could be interpreted as a military alliance operation requiring formal political authorization and intergovernmental coordination. Independent operations with shared information represent individual nations exercising sovereign rights to navigate international waters while maintaining normal communication with friendly vessels in the area. Chinese strategic planners understand exactly what this means. If Beijing responds aggressively to Australian vessels, Japanese destroyers will have real-time awareness of Chinese force disposition and response patterns. If China focuses on the Japanese ships, Australian vessels will operate unmolested while gathering intelligence on Chinese tracking and deterrence capabilities. If Chinese forces attempt to manage both operations simultaneously, they will reveal gaps in coverage, response times, and coordination that Allied intelligence services have been unable to confirm through passive monitoring. The operation creates a no-win scenario for Chinese South China Sea Command. Every possible response provides valuable intelligence to adversaries while demonstrating the inadequacy of current force structure to manage multiple independent challengers. The economic dimension adds pressure that transforms this from a military problem into a regime stability question. China's economy contracted by 8% in the first quarter of 2026, marking the third consecutive quarter of contraction since the export manufacturing sector collapsed under tariff pressure and supply chain reorganization. Youth unemployment reached 7% in March 2026, despite government statistical manipulation designed to obscure the true figure. Domestic debt in China now totals 352% of gross domestic product, with local government financing vehicles carrying $13.8 trillion in obligations that cannot be serviced from current revenue. The Chinese Communist Party maintains domestic legitimacy through two mechanisms: economic growth that creates prosperity and upward mobility, and nationalist rhetoric claiming territorial restoration and rejection of historical humiliation. With economic growth mechanism broken, the party depends entirely on nationalist legitimacy. Any perception that China is backing down from territorial claims in the South China Sea under pressure from Japan, the historic enemy, and Australia, a secondary American ally, would undermine the core narrative sustaining party authority. This creates a trap. If China responds with military aggression to the Australia-Japan transits, it risks conflict with two capable adversaries while the economy is collapsing, and the United States maintains forces in position to exploit any opening. If China allows the transits without serious response, it demonstrates that South China Sea area denial is hollow, inviting additional challenges from other regional powers and undermining 15 years of investment in artificial islands and military infrastructure. Either choice imposes costs the regime may not be able to afford. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what happens in the next 6 weeks will determine whether China maintains control over the South China Sea or whether the entire strategic architecture collapses. This is the inflection point, and you need to be here for every development as this crisis unfolds. The timing of the Australia-Japan announcement reveals sophisticated strategic thinking that suggests detailed coordination with American planners, even though the operations themselves will occur independently. The joint communiqué emerged 48 hours after the United States announced a 90-day pause in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to allow diplomatic engagement on maritime security issues. That pause, announced by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in a brief statement on May 6th, initially appeared to signal American de-escalation or even partial retreat from South China Sea security commitments. Multiple analysis pieces in American defense publications interpreted the pause as evidence that the Biden administration was prioritizing diplomatic relations with Beijing over military posturing in the Indo-Pacific. The Australia-Japan announcement exposed the actual strategy. The American pause removes U.S. forces from waters where they serve primarily as lightning rods for Chinese nationalist rhetoric, while creating space for regional powers to step forward with independent operations that China cannot address using anti-American political framing. When Chinese state media depicts the South China Sea dispute as China versus American imperialism, it resonates with domestic audiences and provides regime legitimacy. When the dispute becomes China versus Australia and Japan defending their independent economic interests, the framing collapses. Beijing cannot credibly claim that Canberra and Tokyo are tools of American imperialism when they are conducting operations. Washington explicitly paused. The shift from American-led to regionally-led enforcement of international maritime law strips China of the political cover that made area denial sustainable. The coordination suggests the three nations developed this strategy months in advance, timing each element to maximize Chinese strategic confusion while minimizing escalation risk. United States forces withdraw temporarily, reducing immediate tension and eliminating the easy target Chinese propaganda uses to justify militarization. Australia and Japan announce enhanced cooperation buried in routine diplomatic language that attracts minimal initial media attention. The first actual operations occur several weeks after the announcement, providing time for diplomatic messaging while ensuring China cannot prepare adequate response. By the time Chinese military planners fully recognize what is happening, the pattern is already established, and reversal becomes politically difficult. The weapon systems and capabilities that Australia and Japan bring to these operations deserve detailed examination because they reveal why China's current force posture in the South China Sea cannot effectively counter this challenge. The Royal Australian Navy operates 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers commissioned between 2017 and 2020. These vessels displace 7,000 tons fully loaded, carry crews of 186, and cost $1 billion Australian dollars per ship. Each destroyer is equipped with the Aegis Combat System, featuring AN/SPY-1D phased array radar, capable of simultaneously tracking over 100 targets at ranges exceeding 250 miles. The weapon payload includes 48 vertical launch cells, carrying combinations of SM-2 surface-to-air missiles with 90-mile range, SM-6 multi-mission missiles capable of engaging aircraft, cruise missiles, and surface targets at ranges up to 150 miles, evolved Sea Sparrow short-range interceptors, and Tomahawk cruise missiles with ranges exceeding 1,000 miles. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force operates 2 Maya-class destroyers commissioned in 2020 and 2021, with 2 additional vessels under construction. These ships displace 8,200 tons, carry crews of 310, and incorporate the Aegis Baseline 9 system with AN/SPY-1DV radar. The vertical launch system holds 96 cells loaded with SM-3 Block II ballistic missile interceptors, SM-6 multi-mission missiles, evolved Sea Sparrow, and ASROC anti-submarine rockets. Additionally, Japan operates 4 Kongo-class and 2 Atago-class Aegis destroyers commissioned between 1993 and 2008, providing a total of 8 major surface combatants with integrated air defense capabilities comparable to American Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. These capabilities matter because they present Chinese forces with a problem they cannot solve using current force structure. The People's Liberation Army Navy operates approximately 45 modern surface combatants in the South China Sea region, including Type 052D guided missile destroyers and Type 054A frigates. These vessels carry capable weapon systems, including YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with 290-mile range and HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles comparable to Russian S-300 systems. However, Chinese destroyers lack the integrated combat system architecture that allows Aegis-equipped vessels to coordinate missile defense across multiple ships while simultaneously prosecuting offensive strikes and managing electronic warfare. An individual Type 052D destroyer can defend itself and engage targets within its sensor coverage. An Aegis destroyer can defend itself, defend other vessels in the task force, coordinate strikes from multiple platforms, manage anti-submarine warfare, and process threat data from airborne early warning aircraft, submarines, and ground installations simultaneously. This architecture advantage means that Australian and Japanese vessels operating with shared tactical data can engage Chinese forces at ranges where Chinese weapons cannot effectively respond. SM-6 missiles launched from Australian destroyers can strike Chinese surface ships 150 miles distant, while Chinese YJ-18 missiles require launch platforms to close within 290 miles, placing them within SM-2 engagement zones where they face overwhelming air defense before reaching firing position. The mathematics of this engagement geometry create what military analysts call a standoff advantage, the ability to destroy an adversary before they can strike back. Chinese forces in the South China Sea lack this advantage against Aegis-equipped opponents, rendering the numerical superiority of People's Liberation Army Navy surface combatants largely irrelevant in direct confrontation. Chinese military planners recognize this problem, which explains the massive investment in shore-based anti-ship ballistic missiles positioned on Hainan Island and the artificial islands in the Spratly Archipelago. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile system has a reported range of 900 miles and approaches targets at speeds exceeding Mach 10, making interception extremely difficult. The DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missile extends this capability to 2,500 miles, theoretically allowing strikes against any surface vessel in the entire South China Sea from launchers based in mainland China. These weapons are designed to offset the standoff advantage of Aegis destroyers by engaging them from distances and speeds that conventional air defense cannot reliably counter. But ballistic missiles targeting moving ships at sea present enormous technical challenges that remain unproven in actual combat. The missiles require real-time targeting data to adjust flight path and engage maneuvering vessels. This requires persistent overhead reconnaissance from satellites, aerial drones, or over-the-horizon radar systems. The reconnaissance assets must survive in contested electromagnetic environments where adversaries are actively jamming sensors, spoofing data links, and potentially destroying reconnaissance platforms. The missile itself must survive the boost phase when it is most vulnerable, survive the mid-course phase when it could be intercepted by SM-3 ballistic missile defense systems, and survive the terminal phase when ships can employ SM-6 missiles, electronic warfare, and close-in weapon systems. If any element of this chain fails, targeting, guidance, boost phase, mid-course, or terminal defense, the missile misses. China has never attempted this full operational sequence against maneuvering warships equipped with modern electronic warfare and missile defense systems. The United States conducted exactly one test of a similar capability in 2021, and that test occurred in a controlled environment with cooperative targets and pre-scripted conditions. Whether Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles can reliably strike moving destroyers in actual combat remains one of the great unknowns of contemporary military analysis. Australian and Japanese planners are betting that the answer is no, or at least that the reliability is low enough that China will not risk war to test the capability. This brings us to the central question that is keeping Chinese military strategists awake at night. How do you respond to the Australia-Japan transits without either appearing weak by allowing them to proceed or appearing reckless by initiating conflict against capable adversaries over freedom of navigation in international waters? China experimented with various response options over the past decade when confronting American freedom of navigation operations. The responses range from diplomatic protests filed with embassies and international organizations to publicizing the transits through state media with nationalistic commentary, to deploying Coast Guard cutters and maritime militia fishing vessels to shadow foreign warships, to flying fighter aircraft in close proximity to demonstrate control, to active radar targeting of foreign vessels with fire control systems, to firing missiles into the ocean near transit routes. Each escalatory step carries increasing risk. Diplomatic protests achieve nothing beyond signaling displeasure. Media coverage builds nationalist pressure that constrains regime flexibility in future confrontations. Shadowing with Coast Guard vessels provides presence, but accomplishes no strategic objective against warships that simply continue on course. Fighter overflights risk collision or miscalculation that triggers unintended escalation. Fire control radar targeting of warships is considered a serious provocation that many nations interpret as imminent attack, justifying preemptive response. Firing missiles anywhere near foreign warships risks accidental hit that starts a war neither side intended. Chinese forces employed all of these responses against American operations at various times over the past 15 years. The pattern reveals an escalation ladder where Beijing climbs until it reaches the step just before the one that would trigger actual American military response, holds at that position until the American vessels complete transit, then resets the ladder for the next operation. This strategy manages to demonstrate Chinese resolve without starting wars, which sounds successful, until you recognize that it means every single American freedom of navigation operation over 15 years occurred exactly as planned, without Chinese forces preventing even one transit. The strategy is theater, not area denial. It creates the appearance of Chinese control while accommodating the reality that China cannot prevent operations by capable adversaries without risking war. This theater only works when the adversary is willing to perform its role in the script. American freedom of navigation operations follow predictable patterns with advance notice provided through military-to-military communication channels. The ships enter Chinese claimed waters, maintain steady course and speed, ignore Chinese shadowing vessels and radio warnings, complete transit, and depart. Chinese forces demonstrate they are tracking and monitoring. American forces demonstrate they do not recognize Chinese sovereignty claims. No shots are fired. Both sides declare victory to domestic audiences. The script is so well established that both navies can execute it while minimizing miscalculation risk. Australia and Japan are not following this script. The June 2026 transits will occur without advance notification through military-to-military channels. The vessels will not follow predictable routes or timing. The operations will occur simultaneously in multiple locations, forcing Chinese commanders to divide attention and response capacity. Most importantly, both Australia and Japan have made clear through diplomatic and defense channels that they will not tolerate the same level of harassment and close approaches that American vessels accept. Royal Australian Navy rules of engagement authorize ship commanders to take defensive action against any platform that approaches within distance, threatening vessel safety. Japan. Maritime Self-Defense Force rules of engagement include similar provisions, with the additional complication that Japanese law does not clearly distinguish between peacetime navigation and armed conflict in situations involving foreign military harassment.